Right now, somewhere in a vault you will never be allowed to enter, sealed inside a box that costs more to maintain than most people's cars, there is a dress. It has not been touched by human hands in decades. It has not been seen by human eyes in nearly as long. And the woman who wore it, who stood inside it at the exact moment the world held its breath, has been gone for over 25 years. Fabric remembers. That is the thing that stone and glass and metal cannot do. A sculpture can honor a person. A portrait can capture a face. But a dress, a real dress, worn by a real woman at a real moment in history, carries something none of those things can hold. It carries absence. It carries the shape of a body that no longer exists. It carries warmth that has long since left the world. Today, we are going to visit 20 of those dresses. 20 garments that stopped being clothing the moment they were worn and became something else entirely. Something closer to evidence. Something closer to memory. Something closer to art. We are going to move through this list from the most culturally explosive to the one at number 20 that almost no one knows about, and I promise you, when we get there, when I tell you what that dress is and what happened to it, you are going to feel it somewhere that has nothing to do with fashion. Stay with me all the way to the end. I keep my promises. And if you are new here, welcome. This channel exists for people who believe that history lives in beautiful things. Subscribe now, because we do this every week, and you are going to want to be here. Let's begin. Number 1, Princess Diana's wedding dress. There are mornings that belong to the whole world. July 29, 1981 was one of them. A 20-year-old woman stepped out of a glass carriage in front of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and approximately 1 billion people watching on television screens across the planet inhaled at exactly the same moment. The dress was designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, a young husband and wife team who had been handed the most scrutinized fashion commission in history and given strict instructions to tell no one, show no one, and trust no one. Sketches were hidden. Fabric was locked away. False designs were leaked to the press deliberately, to feed the frenzy while protecting the real thing. When Diana finally appeared, the world understood why. The gown was ivory silk taffeta, antique lace, 10,000 individual pearls and mother-of-pearl sequins applied by hand, one by one, by a team of seamstresses working in near silence. The sleeves were immense, theatrical clouds of gathered silk that would define the look of an entire decade and inspire every bridal designer working through the 1980s. But the train. 25 feet long. The longest royal bridal train in modern British history. So vast, so extraordinary in its volume that when Diana stepped into the glass coach at Clarence House, it had to be folded and compressed around her like the sails of a ship being put away in a storm. When the carriage doors opened at St. Paul's, the dress emerged visibly creased. The physics of that much fabric in that small a space made it inevitable. It didn't matter. The world saw those creases and loved the dress for them. What most people never knew, sewn invisibly into the underskirts was a small blue bow, the something blue, along with a tiny hand-stitched lucky charm. And woven into the lace itself was a fragment of Carrick Macross lace that had belonged to Queen Mary, Diana's husband's great-great-grandmother. The dress was, literally, number 2 Marilyn Monroe's Happy Birthday, Mr. President gown. If Diana's dress was the most romantically powerful garment ever worn, the number 2 was the most provocatively powerful. And the distance between those two philosophies, between the fairy tale and the spectacle, is exactly as wide as fashion can stretch. May 19, 1962. Madison Square Garden, New York City. A Democratic fundraiser, nominally a birthday celebration for President John F. Kennedy. Marilyn Monroe was scheduled to perform, and she was, as almost always, late. When she finally walked on stage and shed the white ermine coat she'd been wearing over the gown, the room went completely quiet. Under the stage lights, she appeared to be wearing nothing at all. The dress had been designed by Jean Lewis, one of Hollywood's great costume architects, working from an early sketch by a very young Bob Mackie. The concept was staggering in its audacity, a nude-colored silk soufflé, gossamer thin, encrusted with more than 6,000 individually hand-applied rhinestones, placed not at random but following the contours of the body so that under lighting, the effect would be precisely what was intended. Marilyn Monroe, appearing to stand before the President of the United States wearing nothing but diamonds. The dress was so precisely fitted to her exact measurements that she could wear nothing beneath it, not a single layer. On the night, her dresser could not zip it while she was standing. Marilyn had to lie flat. Even then, the fit was so extreme that she was sewn into the gown in the final minutes backstage. She walked on stage. She sang. And fashion was never quite the same. Fashion historians mark that night as the birth of the naked dress as a cultural concept. Every sheer red carpet gown, every nude illusion fabric, every moment of theatrical fashion built around the suggestion of skin rather than its reality, it traces directly back to that stage, that woman, that voice, that extraordinary. Number 3, Jackie Kennedy's pink suit. We pause here because number 3 is not technically a dress. It is a suit. I am including it anyway, because to leave it out of this conversation would be a failure of honesty about what fashion can do and what it has done. November 22, 1963. Dallas, Texas. Jacqueline Kennedy stepped off Air Force One wearing a pink boucle wool suit with a navy collar and a matching pillbox hat. The president had told her she looked wonderful in it. She had worn it before and loved it. That morning in the Texas sunshine, she wore it as part of a carefully considered public image, the elegant First Lady, immaculately turned out, a symbol of American grace. By afternoon, it was something else. Here is the detail that is rarely told: the suit was not, strictly speaking, Chanel. Its design was based on a Chanel pattern, its fabric was genuine Chanel cloth sent from Paris, but the construction was done in New York by a house called Chez Ninon, which produced high-quality American versions of European couture for prominent clients. The reason was political. By 1961, Jackie's patronage of French fashion had drawn criticism. The solution was elegant and diplomatically shrewd: take the Chanel fabric, take the Chanel design, and sew it in New York. Technically American. Artistically, unmistakably French. The irony, of course, is that the suit became not a symbol of American sophistication but the most haunting garment in American history. In the hours after the assassination, as Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president aboard Air Force One, she stood beside him still wearing it. When an aide gently suggested she change, she said simply, "I want them to see what they've done." 7 words. That suit. That decision. A woman using the language of clothing to make a statement so precise it needed no amplification. The suit is now held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, in an acid-free container in a climate-controlled, zero-light environment. By direct request from Caroline Kennedy, it is not to be displayed publicly until the year 2103, 100 years after the assassination. No living human being outside the archival staff is permitted to see it. There is a garment in this world that exists right now, in a vault, in the dark, that no one is allowed to look at. And it happens to be one of the most historically significant pieces of clothing ever worn. That fact alone is extraordinary. Number 4, Grace Kelly's wedding dress. From Dallas to Monaco. From the most haunting garment in this list to one of the most beautiful. In April of 1956, one of the most celebrated women in the world, an Academy Award-winning Hollywood actress who had graced the cover of every major magazine on earth, became a princess. And she did it wearing a dress that remains, nearly 70 years later, among the most admired wedding gowns ever made. Grace Kelly's gown was a gift from MGM Studios. It was designed by Helen Rose, the studio's chief costume designer, who had dressed Grace on screen and understood precisely the architecture of her beauty. Rose understood that this dress would be seen by more people than any costume she would ever create. She approached it accordingly. The gown used 25 yards of silk taffeta and 25 yards of silk net. The bodice was covered in re-embroidered rosepoint lace more than 100 years old, sourced from a museum collection and hand-applied over 6 weeks by an entire team of seamstresses. 300 individual pearls were worked into the lace of the bodice alone. The skirt was built from 4 layers of silk petticoats, creating a silhouette that was simultaneously formal, romantic, and architecturally perfect. The veil, 90 yards of silk illusion tulle, anchored by a Juliet cap of matching antique lace and scattered with seed pearls. But it's the private details that stay with you. Instead of a bouquet, Grace carried a small ivory prayer book covered in the same lace as her bodice, with a single white orchid laid across it. Startlingly modest for a woman who had been one of the most photographed people alive. And inside her shoes, because Grace Kelly was acutely aware that Prince Rainier was not a tall man, and she was determined not to make him feel diminished on their wedding day, she wore low heels. And pressed into the sole of each shoe, against the silk lining, was a small penny. A good luck charm she had carried since childhood. A Hollywood star walking into a new life with her feet pressed against luck. Today the dress lives at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the city where she was born. It is the museum's single most visited object, more requested than any painting, any sculpture, anything else in a collection of extraordinary things. It is kept in a sealed, climate-controlled case. Conservators assess it regularly. It is treated, in every sense, as a national treasure. Number 5, Queen Elizabeth II Coronation Dress. June 2, 1953. Westminster Abbey, London. What made this coronation different from every one before it was television? For the first time in human history, cameras had been permitted inside the Abbey. The ceremony was broadcast live to the British public and to audiences across the Commonwealth. It was, by any measure, the first truly global television event in history. At its center stood a 26-year-old woman in a dress that had been designed as a statement of near-impossible symbolic complexity. Norman Hartnell, the Queen's official dressmaker, had been given a brief that would have paralyzed most designers. The gown had to represent every nation of the British Commonwealth. It had to be appropriate for a religious ceremony of the highest order. It had to bear the physical weight of the robe, the orb, and the scepter. And it had to photograph beautifully on black and white television while appearing magnificent in person. What he produced is widely considered the single most technically ambitious dress of the 20th century. White satin, liquid and pure. Embroidered across its entire surface with the national floral emblems of the Commonwealth, the English rose, the Scottish thistle, the Welsh leek and daffodil, the Irish shamrock, the Australian wattle, the New Zealand silver fern, the Canadian maple leaf, the South African protea, the Indian and Ceylonese lotus. Each one executed in gold and silver thread, seed pearls, crystals, amethysts, and rose diamonds. The total weight of the embroidery was significant enough that Elizabeth practiced wearing the dress for weeks before the ceremony, learning to adjust her posture in stride so that the additional weight would not alter the natural grace of her movement. Hartnell worked on this gown for 8 months. He submitted 9 complete designs before the Queen selected the final version. And there is one detail that she did not know until after the ceremony. Hartnell had hidden, stitched into the folds of the skirt on the left side, a tiny 4-leaf clover. The Queen's hand would rest near it during key moments of the service. It was his private gift to her. A secret talisman. A couturier's act of love sewn into the fabric of history. The dress is now preserved at Windsor Castle under conditions of exceptional security. The weight of history it carries, the first televised coronation, the beginning of a 70-year reign, the moment a young woman became the longest-serving monarch in British history, makes it, in every meaningful sense, beyond price. Number 6, Queen Victoria's Wedding Dress. If you have ever worn white to your wedding, if you have ever dreamed of doing so, you owe that to one woman. And the extraordinary thing is that she did not choose white for the reason almost everyone assumes. Queen Victoria married Prince Albert on February 10, 1840 at the Chapel Royal of St. James's Palace in London. The expectation for a royal bride at the time was rich-colored gold, silver, deep jewel tones, fabrics decorated with precious materials as a declaration of power and wealth. White was not a bridal color. White was barely fashionable at all. Victoria chose white for a reason both practical and deeply touching. She wanted to showcase extraordinary Huntington lace, handmade by craftswomen from Devon and the East Midlands, many of whom were suffering severe economic hardship. The lace industry had fallen into difficult times. Victoria saw her wedding as an opportunity to direct international attention and the demand that followed toward British lacemakers. White was the only color that would allow the intricate patterns of the lace to show at their full beauty. Any other color would overwhelm them. The dress was white silk satin, its bodice and train entirely covered in that exquisite handmade lace. The train extended 4.5 meters and was carried by 12 bridesmaids. Victoria's diary for the day describes her as very happy if overwhelmingly nervous, and records that Albert looked beautiful. The impact on fashion was seismic and immediate. Within years, white had become the dominant bridal color across Europe and eventually across the Western world. Victoria had invented the modern bride, not by decree, not by intention, but through a single personal, pragmatic, profoundly stylish choice. And to ensure that choice remained uniquely hers, the lace templates, the patterns used to create her specific designs, were destroyed after the dress was completed. There would be no copies. No dress would ever be made from the same lace. The Queen intended to be singular, and she succeeded. Today the dress is preserved at Kensington Palace in London, in very low light to protect silk that is now nearly 2 centuries old. Its value, historical and financial, is incalculable. We have been imitating her for almost 200 years. That is what genuine style looks like. Number 7, Audrey Hepburn's black dress from Breakfast at Tiffany's. There are film costumes. And then there are garments that transcend the film entirely and become something independent, icons of pure style that belong not to cinema but to culture. Hubert de Givenchy's black dress for Audrey Hepburn in the opening scene of Breakfast at Tiffany's is the supreme example of this. It is quite possibly the most recognizable dress in the history of film. It is certainly among the most copied. And it is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most influential pieces of clothing made in the 20th century. The year was 1961. Director Blake Edwards was adapting Truman Capote's novella for Paramount Pictures, and Audrey Hepburn had been cast as Holly Golightly. Hepburn had a long-standing and deeply personal creative relationship with Givenchy, the French couturier who had dressed her for Roman Holiday and Sabrina and who understood, perhaps better than anyone, the specific architecture of her elegance. She asked for him specifically. The gown for the opening sequence, the one in which Holly steps from a yellow cab in the early morning light on Fifth Avenue, coffee and pastry in hand, gazing into Tiffany's window, was a column of black satin, floor-length, sleeveless, with a deeply open back. Simple. Severe. Architectural. Against Audrey's extraordinary neck and jawline, the long cigarette holder, the enormous dark sunglasses, the elaborate upswept hair, it became one of those visual images so perfect that it seems, in retrospect, inevitable. Here is the detail most people don't know: Givenchy's original design was significantly shorter. The Paramount executives reviewed the costume and asked for the hemline to be lowered, judging the original too provocative for 1961 sensibilities. The dress was altered. Made longer. More modest. The version we all know was born from a compromise. And the compromise produced perfection. Yet another reminder that great work is rarely made under perfect conditions. One of the 3 original versions of the dress sold at Christie's London in 2006 for the equivalent of nearly $1 million at the time. A second is displayed at the Museo del Traje in Madrid. A third is held in a private collection. If you have ever worn a little black dress, and statistically, you almost certainly have, you are participating in a tradition that runs directly through Audrey Hepburn standing on Fifth Avenue at 6 in the morning with a Danish pastry, looking as though she owned the world. In a sense, she did. Number 8, the imperial gown of Empress Elizabeth of Austria. We travel now to Vienna. To the Hofburg Palace. To a woman who was arguably the most obsessively celebrated beauty in European royal history, and who paid for that obsession with nearly everything. Elizabeth of Austria, known to history as Sisi, was Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary. Married at 16 to Emperor Franz Joseph in a union arranged with the clinical efficiency of a state treaty, she was expected to be decorative, to produce heirs, to smile at banquets, to conform. She spent the rest of her life refusing, spectacularly, to do any of it. The battle she waged was fought almost entirely through her body. Her waist, at its narrowest, measured 49 centimeters, roughly the width of a sheet of A4 paper. She maintained it through a regime of near starvation, obsessive gymnastics, cold baths, and corsetry that by any modern measure constitutes extreme body modification. She was measured constantly. She weighed herself daily. If the scale moved in the wrong direction, she withdrew from public life until she corrected it. Her gowns were designed by Charles Frederick Worth, the English-born couturier working in Paris who founded the world's first true fashion house and effectively invented haute couture as a concept. His work for Sisi represents some of his most demanding commissions. The dresses had to contain that impossible waist, support the enormous skirts required by mid-Victorian fashion, and still allow the Empress, who was among the finest horsewomen in Europe, the freedom of movement she demanded. Her most famous surviving gown, displayed at the Sisi Museum within the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, is a masterpiece of ivory silk scattered with hand-embroidered gold stars. Conservators describe examining it as looking at a piece of sculpture rather than a garment. The waist is so impossibly small that staff handle it with a kind of reverence that edges past professionalism into something resembling awe. But here is the detail that turns admiration into something more complex. After the age of 30, Sisi refused to be photographed or painted. Not a single image was made of her from that point forward with her permission. She had been celebrated for her beauty since girlhood, and she refused to allow the world to witness its diminishment. She would be remembered young, or she would not be remembered at all. The gowns that remain are relics of a woman simultaneously imprisoned and liberated by beauty. They are heartbreaking in their delicacy. They are utterly unforgettable. Number 9, the dresses of Marie Antoinette. If Sisi was obsessive about beauty, she learned, consciously or otherwise, from the woman who had established the template for royal fashion as spectacle nearly a century before her. Marie Antoinette arrived at the French court of Versailles as a 14-year-old Austrian archduchess and within a few years had become the most discussed woman in Europe. Not for her politics. Not for her intellect. For her clothes. Her hairstyles. Her shoes. Her jewels. For the extraordinary, almost theatrical excess of her public appearances, in which she presented herself as a living artwork so visually overwhelming that observers genuinely struggled for words. Her dresses were produced through a collaboration with Rose Bertin, a milliner and dressmaker who had established herself in Paris and who became, through royal patronage, effectively the world's first celebrity designer. Bertin was no backroom seamstress. She was a creative director. She understood that dressing the Queen of France was a political act, and she approached every commission with the seriousness it deserved. Together, they created looks that pushed the absolute limits of what was structurally possible to wear. The panniers, rigid side hoops that extended the skirt horizontally to extraordinary widths, required Marie Antoinette to enter certain rooms sideways. The headdresses were elaborate architectural constructions of powdered hair, feathers, silk, and sometimes miniature scenes, a sailing ship, a garden that rose more than a meter above her head. These were not outfits. They were performances. Most of her wardrobe was destroyed during the French Revolution, consumed by the fires of a public fury that found in her clothes the perfect symbol of everything it had decided to despise. What survives are fragments, scraps of silk preserved by chance, a few complete pieces that made their way into royal and museum collections. You can see surviving textiles in period reconstructions at the Palace of Versailles and at the Musée Galliera in Paris. The perfect irony of her story, Marie Antoinette, the woman synonymous with excess, once sat for a portrait wearing a simple white muslin dress. When it was exhibited, the scandal was immediate. People said she looked as though she was in her underwear. That she was debasing her position. A queen who dressed simply was, apparently, even more offensive than one who dressed extravagantly. She simply could not win. Too much was decadent. Too little was indecent. And the space between was never hers to occupy. Number 10, Christian Dior's New Look, 1947. The Second World War ended in 1945. But its texture was everywhere still, in rationed food, in rationed fabric, in the grey practical utility of wartime fashion, in which women had worn shortened skirts and tailored, no-nonsense silhouettes because nothing more was permitted, and had done so with remarkable grace. And then, in February of 1947, a 42-year-old Frenchman held his first fashion show. The collection was called The New Look, a name given to it on the spot by Harper's Bazaar editor Carmel Snow, who reportedly turned to Christian Dior after the show and said, simply, "Your clothes have a new look." The name stuck immediately and permanently. The centerpiece, the piece that appeared in every newspaper, that sparked furious debate in parliaments and on city streets, was a cream-colored bar jacket paired with a black skirt so full it required up to 20 meters of fabric in a single garment. The jacket created a rounded shoulder, a nipped waist, a gently padded hip, a silhouette that celebrated the female form in ways that wartime fashion had entirely abandoned. The skirt swept to below the calf, full and swirling and magnificent, in direct defiance of fabric restrictions that were still technically in effect. Women wept at the show. Some with joy. Some, it was reported, with something more complicated, the feeling that something lost had been returned to them. That femininity, in all its deliberate, constructed, magnificent artifice, had been allowed to exist again. Not everyone was pleased. In London, where rationing was ongoing, women who wore the new silhouette were sometimes confronted by angry strangers who accused them of wasteful extravagance. The British government officially disapproved. In America, a group called the Little Below the Knee Club was formed specifically to protest the longer hemline. None of it mattered. The new look swept the world. The original bar suit and skirt are preserved today at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and at the Musée Christian Dior in Granville, France. They represent not just a fashion moment but the moment fashion itself chose to reclaim its right to exist, for beauty, for romance, for the sheer pleasure of wearing something that cost more than it needed to and was all the better for it. Dior said he wanted women to look like flowers. He succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. Number 11, Coco Chanel's Little Black Dress. And now we meet the woman whose philosophy was almost the precise opposite of Christian Dior and who was, in her own way, equally revolutionary. Before Coco Chanel, black was not elegant. Black was the color of mourning, of absence, of withdrawal from life. Respectable women wore black to funerals and during the first months of widowhood, and then put it away and returned to color as soon as social convention permitted. Black as a daily choice, black as sophistication, as liberation, as the chicest thing a woman could put on that simply did not exist before Gabrielle Bernard Chanel decided to make it so. In 1926, Chanel published a sketch in American Vogue of a simple, short, sleeveless black dress with a straight hemline and long narrow sleeves. The magazine compared it to the Model T Ford, the symbol, at that moment, of democratic modernity. The implication was deliberate: this was not a dress for the wealthy. This was a dress for every woman. Functional. Eternally appropriate. Free of corsetry, free of ornamentation, free of the structural imprisonment that had defined women's fashion for centuries. Chanel had grown up in poverty, in an orphanage, in genuine hardship. She had spent her career designing the opposite of aristocratic excess. She wanted women to move freely, to breathe freely, to live in their clothes rather than being lived in by them. The little black dress was the purest expression of that philosophy. The great anecdote of the era: her rival, designer Paul Poiret, a man of enormous fame and flamboyance, stopped Chanel on the street after the dress appeared and asked who she was in mourning for. She replied, "You, sir." She was burying the era of decorative excess that Poiret represented. She was burying the old world. And she was right. Poiret's fashion house did not survive the decade. Chanel's brand has survived the century. Original pieces from the 1926 collection are preserved at the Palais Galliera in Paris and at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, where they are treated with the reverence of artistic masterpieces. Because that is what they are. Number 12, Queen Fabiola of Belgium's wedding dress by Balenciaga. From Chanel's radical simplicity to a dress that proved definitively that minimalism and royalty are not mutually exclusive. Queen Fabiola of Belgium had something few royal clients ever had with their designer: a genuine, deep friendship. Her friend was Cristobal Balenciaga, born in the Basque Country, trained across Paris, London, and Madrid, and by the late 1950s the undisputed master of his art. Dior called him the master of us all. Givenchy trained under him. Chanel, not known for generosity toward competitors, said he was the only true couturier. For Fabiola's wedding to King Baudouin in December 1960, Balenciaga designed a gown of deliberate, almost shocking simplicity. Pure white silk satin. No embroidery. No pearls. No crystals. No decorative excess whatsoever. And then, as the single concession to drama, a collar and train trimmed entirely in white mink fur. One statement of luxury in an ocean of restraint. The effect was extraordinary. In an era of elaborate royal wedding gowns, this dress looked almost brutally modern. It was a sculpture in fabric. The kind of design that looks effortless precisely because everything unnecessary has been rigorously removed. In the final days before the ceremony, Balenciaga reportedly traveled to Brussels himself, locked himself in a room at the palace, and completed the final fittings and adjustments alone. The stitches at the hem. The alignment of the fur at the collar. Finished by the master's own hands, in private, in the way that only Balenciaga ever truly insisted upon. Today the dress lives at the Museo Balenciaga in Guetaria on the northern coast of Spain, the town where he was born. To see it in person is to understand, in a way that photographs cannot convey, what it means to call a garment a work of art. Number 13, the Gilded Age Court Presentation Gown. We cross the Atlantic, because the story of American Gilded Age fashion is, in many ways, the story of women using clothing as a social weapon. In the final decades of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th, the daughters and wives of America's new industrial fortunes, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Belmonts, the Carnegies, engaged in a fashion arms race of almost comic ferocity. Worth in Paris was their designer of choice. They spent sums on their wardrobes that would be extraordinary by any era's standards. Court presentation gowns, the elaborate, highly formalized dresses required for formal presentations to European royalty, were among their most coveted commissions. They wore them as a means of purchasing a social legitimacy that American money alone could not buy. A Worth label was not just a fashion statement. It was a passport. A surviving court presentation gown from approximately 1890, held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute in New York, makes this world immediate and visceral. Pale ivory silk satin, covered in hand-embroidered silver threadwork, a train extending nearly 3 meters, a bodice constructed with the precision of engineering rather than dressmaking. The Worth label inside belongs to the only designer that mattered. To see it today is to understand something about that era that reading cannot quite convey. The sheer weight of the dress, the physical weight of fabric, embroidery, and construction, tells you what it meant to dress for power in that world. You did not merely wear these clothes. You bore them. You performed in them. And in performing, you announced to every person in the room exactly what kind of woman you were and what kind of world you intended to inhabit. Number 14, the Titanic survivor's dress. Not all the dresses in this list are famous for their beauty. Some are famous for what they survived. In the collection of the Titanic Belfast Museum in Northern Ireland, the city where the great ship was built, there is a dress that crossed the North Atlantic in April of 1912. It belonged to a woman who survived the sinking. She kept it for the rest of her life, understanding, without quite articulating it, that it was no longer merely a garment. It was a document. A material record. Evidence of something so vast and so terrible that no written account of it has ever been fully adequate to the reality. The dress is an Edwardian walking suit. Navy wool. A fitted jacket. A skirt in the slightly A-line silhouette fashionable in 1912. Practical and well-made, designed for the everyday realities of an ocean crossing. Not a dining room gown. Not a costume for the theater. A real dress, worn by a real woman, going somewhere. And then the night came. What makes this piece extraordinary is not what it is. It is what it represents. The Titanic disaster was, among many other things, a story about class, about who reached the lifeboats and who was left behind, about survival and inequality in the way that wealth determines proximity to rescue. Every piece of clothing preserved from that night carries within it the weight of that story. The weight of all those stories. The dress is displayed in a sealed, climate-controlled case at the museum. Protected from the light and air that would accelerate its deterioration. Treated, in every meaningful sense, as what it is. Irreplaceable. Number 15, the Gibson Girl Shirtwaist. Fashion history tends to celebrate the extraordinary. The gowns worn by queens and movie stars, the commissions from the wealthiest women in the world. But occasionally a garment enters the historical record not because of its cost or its wearer but because of what it meant to millions of ordinary women whose names we will never know. The shirtwaist, a tailored blouse worn with a matching skirt, swept America in the late 1890s and early 1900s. It was not a luxury item. It was, in fact, a garment born directly from the democratization of fashion, from the rise of department stores and ready-to-wear manufacturing, and from the entrance of millions of women into the American workforce as clerks, shopgirls, factory workers, and teachers. It was practical. It was washable. It allowed freedom of movement. It was dignified without being elaborate. And it was something a woman could buy on a modest salary, put on in the morning, and feel, in the wearing of it, like a participant in modern life. The Gibson Girl, the idealized American woman depicted by illustrator Charles Dana Gibson in hundreds of drawings published in Life magazine through the 1890s and 1900s, wore the shirtwaist as her signature. She was tall, confident, independent, and fashionable. The shirtwaist was her uniform. It became the garment of American aspiration, of the new woman, of the belief that femininity and freedom could exist in the same body at the same time. Surviving examples are preserved at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. They are treated with the same careful attention given to any garment of historical significance. Because the story they tell of women entering public life, of fashion becoming democratic, of clothing as a statement of participation rather than status, is one of the most important stories in American social history. Number 16, Empress Eugenie's Second Empire Ball Gown. We return to Europe. To the court of Napoleon III. To a woman who was, for 2 extraordinary decades in the middle of the 19th century, the single most powerful fashion influence in the world. More influential, arguably, than any queen. Because she was not merely wearing fashion. She was generating it. Empress Eugenie of France, born Eugenia Maria de Montijo de Guzman, a Spanish countess who married Napoleon III in 1853, found herself suddenly at the center of the most glamorous court in Europe. Versailles had been the axis of Western fashion under Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette. Now, with the Second Empire, Paris reclaimed that position, and Eugenie was its living embodiment. Her collaboration with Charles Frederick Worth, the same Worth who would later dress Cece, was one of the great designer-client partnerships in history. Worth designed for Eugenie with a freedom and inventiveness that he could exercise with almost no one else. She trusted him absolutely. She wore his designs to every state occasion, every reception, every diplomatic dinner. And because every woman in Europe was watching what the Empress of France wore, every choice she and Worth made together was immediately disseminated across the continent and across the Atlantic. A surviving Second Empire ball gown from this period, held at the Musée Galliera in Paris, is a masterpiece of mid-Victorian couture. Pale blue silk voile. A décolletage trimmed in Valenciennes lace. A skirt supported by an enormous crinoline that required its own architectural logic to construct, embroidered throughout with silver thread in a floral pattern of such complexity that it would have required an entire workshop of skilled embroiderers working for months to complete. To stand before this dress today is to understand, immediately and viscerally, what power looked like in 1860. It was not subtle. It was not modest. It was exactly this. Number 17, Elsa Schiaparelli's lobster dress. Now we take a sharp left turn. Because not all the dresses in this list are significant for their beauty or their historical weight or their connection to power. Some are significant because their creator decided that fashion was not decoration but art, surrealist art specifically, and that a dress could be a provocation, a punchline, a dreamscape, and a challenge to every received idea of what clothing was supposed to be. Elsa Schiaparelli was Italian by birth, Parisian by adoption, and surrealist by instinct. She collaborated with Salvador Dali, with Jean Cocteau, with Man Ray. She put a shoe on a hat. She designed a jacket that looked like a ribcage. She made perfume bottles shaped like female torsos. She was, in every possible sense, the opposite of Coco Chanel, whom she despised, and who returned the sentiment with equal warmth, once describing Schiaparelli as that Italian artist who makes clothes, as if this were an insult. It was, of course, exactly the point. The lobster dress, created in 1937 in direct collaboration with Salvador Dali, is a masterpiece of surrealist fashion. It is a white silk organza evening gown, entirely conventional in its construction, distinguished from 1,000 other white evening gowns by a single extraordinary addition, a large red lobster, painted by Dali himself onto the skirt fabric, positioned at the hip with supreme, deadpan confidence. Wallace Simpson, the American for whom King Edward VIII would abdicate his throne, wore the dress for a portrait photographed by Cecil Beaton. The image became one of the most reproduced photographs of the 1930s. The dress became one of the most discussed garments of the decade. And the lobster, absurd, unexpected, and entirely perfect, became a symbol of fashion's capacity to be genuinely, joyfully strange. The original is preserved at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It is a work of art as significant as anything hanging on the museum's walls, because it asks the same questions great art always asks: what is this? Why is it here? What does it mean? And why, against all reasonable expectation, does it work so perfectly? Number 18, the Fortuny Delphos gown. Some dresses are revolutionary. Some are beautiful. And some are so far ahead of their time that they exist in a category of their own, belonging not to the era that made them but to something wider and more lasting. Mariano Fortuny was a Spaniard working in Venice at the turn of the 20th century. His Delphos gown, first created around 1907 and produced in various iterations for nearly 4 decades, is one of the most astonishing achievements in the history of fashion design. On first inspection, it is absurdly simple. A column of pleated silk, falling from the shoulder to the floor, held at the sides by Venetian glass beads, with no structure, no boning, no support of any kind. The pleating is as fine as breath. The silk glows with a luminosity that seems to come from inside the fabric itself, achieved through a dyeing and finishing process that Fortuny kept secret for his entire life and that has never been fully replicated since his death. The Delphos took its name from the charioteer of Delphi, a Greek sculpture Fortuny used as his reference for the way pleated fabric could fall and move over a body. It was entirely unlike anything being made in its era. While the early fashion houses were still working with structured, padded garments that imposed shape on the body from without, Fortuny was making a dress that simply fell, that trusted the body to give it form, that moved with its wearer rather than constraining her. The gown was sold not through fashion houses but rolled and stored in a small box. The pleating compressed. It was shipped to customers like a scroll. When unrolled and placed on a body, it released back into its full beauty. You rolled a Fortuny the way you roll a painting. You unrolled it the way you would unroll a dream. Delphos gowns are now among the most sought-after items in museum costume collections worldwide, held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the V&A in London, the Fortuny Museum in Venice, and many others. Their value has increased decade by decade, because they are not merely antique. They are genuinely inimitable. No one since Fortuny's death in 1949 has been able to recreate the pleating. The secret died with him. Number 19, the House of Worth gown from the Vanderbilt Ball, 1883. And now we come to the greatest party in American Gilded Age history. The year was 1883. Alva Smith Vanderbilt, wife of William Kissam Vanderbilt, granddaughter-in-law of Cornelius Vanderbilt, and one of the most determinedly ambitious social climbers in the history of New York, had just completed construction on a new mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue. $3 million. Modeled on a French chateau. Its own art collection, its own gymnasium, its own theater. And Alva needed an occasion grand enough to introduce it to the world. She planned a costume ball. 1,200 invitations went out to New York's most prominent citizens, and notably, deliberately, pointedly, not to Mrs. Caroline Astor, who at that moment considered herself the undisputed queen of New York society and had not yet officially acknowledged the Vanderbilts as socially acceptable. They were new money. Railway money. Industrial money. They had more of it than nearly anyone on earth, but in the eyes of old New York, they lacked lineage. The Vanderbilt ball changed everything in a single evening. Mrs. Astor was forced to call on Alva to request an invitation, and in that single social capitulation, the gates of New York's highest society were permanently opened to the industrial fortunes of the Gilded Age. The dress Alva wore was made by the House of Worth in Paris. It depicted, in lavish embroidery and applique, a Venetian princess of the 16th century, silk brocade, seed pearls, golden thread, historical detail of extraordinary precision. The bill from Worth was astronomical. But Alva Vanderbilt had not invited 1,200 people to be impressed by restraint. A comparable Worth ball gown from this exact period, believed to have been worn to the ball itself or to one of the numerous events surrounding it, is held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute, where it is displayed as the centerpiece of the museum's Gilded Age fashion holdings. Because it represents not merely a garment but a moment, the moment an industry's worth of ambition dressed itself in silk, went to a party, and changed the social order of the most powerful city in America. Number 20, the mystery dress of Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna. I promised you, at the very beginning, that the dress at number 20 would surprise you. That it would leave you with a story you had never quite heard before. That it would stay with you. Here it is. In the collections of the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia, among the Rembrandts and the Rubens and the extraordinary accumulation of imperial treasure gathered over centuries by the Romanov dynasty, there is a dress that most visitors pass without a second glance. It is not the most beautiful thing in the room. It does not have the dramatic silhouette of a Worth ball gown or the fairy tale grandeur of a royal wedding gown. By the standards of Imperial Russian fashion, it is relatively modest, a pale lilac silk evening dress, high-necked, long-sleeved, embroidered with small silver flowers, bearing the distinctive mark of the Imperial Russian court dressmakers who supplied the Romanov family in the early years of the 20th century. But here is what makes this dress extraordinary. This dress was ordered, fitted, and completed for Tsarina Alexandra in the spring of 1918. She was measured for it in captivity. She wore it, or may have worn it, may simply have had it made, never worn at all, in the final weeks of her life. Before the night of July 16 and 17, 1918. The night she and her husband, Tsar Nicholas II, and their 5 children were taken to the basement of the Althorp House in Ekaterinburg and shot by Bolshevik forces in one of the most infamous acts of political violence in modern European history. The dress survived. The family did not. How it survived, how it moved from Ekaterinburg to the Hermitage is a story of extraordinary archival detective work that occupied Russian historians and museum curators for decades after the fall of the Soviet Union. The short version, it was removed from the Althorp House in the days following the execution by a member of the local Soviet who understood, even in the revolutionary fervor of that July, that he was standing in the presence of history. It passed through a chain of private hands. It was hidden, repeatedly. And eventually, after the Soviet Union collapsed and Russian institutions began the incomplete and extraordinary process of reconstructing what had been lost or concealed, it found its way to the Hermitage. A dress ordered in captivity. Made for a woman who did not survive the summer. A dress that outlived an empire, survived a revolution, passed through decades of secrecy, and now sits in a museum in the city the Romanovs built. That is what makes a dress genuinely priceless. Not the value of its fabric. Not the fame of its wearer. Not the price it fetched at auction. It is the story it carries. The history it survived. The impossible, tenacious persistence of silk and thread against the tide of everything that tried to destroy it. And the fun fact I promised you. When Princess Diana's wedding dress was created, the Emanuel studio worked under the extraordinary secrecy I described. What I did not tell you earlier is this: they did not keep the final pattern. They could not safely preserve it. Too many people were trying to obtain information about the design before the wedding. So the pattern was destroyed before the wedding took place. And when, years later, Elizabeth Emanuel was commissioned to produce an accurate replica for display purposes, she had to work from photographs and measurements alone. There was no blueprint. No template. No master document. The instructions for creating the most famous wedding dress in the history of the 20th century no longer exist. They were gone before the century was out. Fashion is fragile. History is fragile. The things we make from silk and lace and ambition and grief and love and joy, the things we imagine are permanent, are more delicate than we know. Which is, perhaps, why the ones that survive matter so much. Thank you for spending this time here. If any of these 20 dresses moved you, if any of these stories landed somewhere unexpected, I would genuinely love to know which one. Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. If you found someone who loves history and fashion and the extraordinary persistence of beautiful things, share this with them. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, now is the moment. We do this every week, and the stories we have still to tell are extraordinary. Until then, stay elegant.